Welcome to Capital Ideas, where we celebrate the innovators who enrich our lives and the capital markets that make it all possible. My name is Nick Morgan. I am the co-host of Capital Ideas and the co-founder of ICAN, the Investor Choice Advocates Network.
And I'm Darrell Albright. I am the co-host of Capital Ideas and a proud board member of ICAN. And today we have with us Vince Molinari, the CEO of Fintech TV, and also Vince brings with him a extensive career and background in investment banking. So I thought maybe, Vince, you could start by talking a little bit about how the investment banking landscape and environment has changed over the decades, especially pertaining to raising money for small cap IPOs.
Well, first of all, Dara and Nick, thank you so much, and delighted to be on Capital Ideas. And congratulations, big shout out on all the great work that you're advancing at ICANN. Core to so much of the common DNA that we've had and shared conversations and advocacy over the years. So delighted to be here today. Dara, it's a great question. I think, as we look at so much in capital markets, in investment banking as an evolution and adaptation. And I think we've seen this kind of compression of access to capital to probably the most important sector in the world, certainly in the United States, as our entrepreneurs, our innovators, our job creators, right? Which really, we lose connectivity to realizing that that's the engine of growth for our country, where our small, medium-sized enterprises, some work out, some don't, but some become some of the biggest companies that we have in our country. And that, to me, speaks to the sustainability of our nation, right? To continue to innovate and bring forward new economic growth and ideas. So it's been a real challenge in many cases, as you know, going back to so many of our conversations before the Jobs Act, culminating in the Jobs Act, and since then, really, how do we continue to facilitate that access to capital? And the investment banking world has changed dramatically, where when you don't have that distribution, certainly on the public company side, we lost a vast majority of our retail firms that were the ones who were covering and bringing liquidity to those securities. You kind of throw a kink in the system, right? So we always talk about the exit before we've been in something. So we've seen that such an elongated period of time to those potential public IPOs, not a whole lot of liquidity in the system for some of the small to mid caps, and which has also been so much that we worked on too, right? The advent of growth in private companies, right? And coming earlier in the cycle. So I think technology itself has really begun to bring so much of a change to capital formation and investment banking, and utilizing platforms and broker-dealers that are now in an electronic format that are starting to replace some of that.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the next question. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how fintech is really changing the environment, making it easier for small cap companies to access capital, and for retail investors, but by the same token, to be able to then participate in the appreciation of getting into some of those companies that are raising capital to the public at earlier stages.
Well, you touched on something right there that I think is quite underspoken about, Dara. And I know you and Nick have been around this for years as well. So we talk about the democratization of access to capital for our entrepreneurs, for our growth companies, but it's really the democratization on the backside of that, in parallel, of wealth creation, right? Giving retail investors the opportunity to have access to opportunities earlier in the cycle that they wouldn't ordinarily have before the valuation expansion is way up here and they get a shot, right? So that portion, I think it's important to continue to bring forward. And again, I'll go back to technology and innovation. The ability to use platforms to close some of that delta where we've had inefficiency, to give access to investors to those opportunities on platforms. And again, whether we're talking about CF opportunities, Reg D 506C, Reg A, right? That whole ability to be able to broadcast or advertise, let people know that opportunities are out there. And then to have a framework as that funnel, as a pathway for people to onboard and to invest and have the opportunity because they want to make a decision to invest in something that's important to them, right? And I won't get on the whole soapbox just yet about some of the constraints that we have there from regulators and in some cases legislators, but how do we continue to facilitate that, right? And have a level playing field, grant access. And I think so much so for me, knowing that, it's 35 years since I'm licensed in the capital markets finance business, to realize the role of media, right? Education and awareness, things like Fintech TV and other platforms, even what you're doing with ICAN and this series in Capital Ideas, to bring that education awareness forward and allow people to take action. And the best way they're taking action largely is through technology innovation on platforms.
That's terrific, Vince. And you mentioned regulatory barriers. Obviously, one of the things we're focused on at ICAN is trying to take down some of those regulatory barriers to the democratization of the capital markets. What would you say, if you can isolate one or two, have been the biggest regulatory barriers that are preventing this democratization from taking place?
Well, look, I think I feel like a broken record in some cases, Nick, and we've had these conversations and trying to write petitions, comment letters, and bringing things forward, going back as early as before the Jobs Act and creating that act. So the removal of the ban on general solicitation, I think, was so important. Going back to Congressman McHenry in the early days of crowdfunding for equity. So getting those things through the system, but what was 6 months mandated became 5 years, right? Plus in rulemaking to actually get the implementation. So, as pleased as I am to have most of that done, a lost opportunity in a 5-year period, to me, I think unnecessarily, right? So I think, it is incumbent for us to have investor protection and balance the access to capital and the growth. But come on, we have to toggle that a little bit faster because we're losing so much of the race on innovation. For me, when we talk about blockchain, and different from crypto, right? I think we have to decouple the power of blockchain DLT as systems, digital assets, the ability to transform and track and provenance. I personally believe that evolution, and I'll characterize it much different than a revolution that many of our friends in cryptography may like to think it was going to have and displace traditional market infrastructure. It's embracing that technology, having greater clarity or clarity in rules. And yes, we can all talk about the Howey test and acknowledge that these are securities, but what are clear and decisive ways that we can grow and engage instead of regulation by enforcement? And then there's a whole category, I believe, where we need to look at digitization in the form of CFTC and a regulatory framework, and maybe thinking about things out of the box a little bit. Maybe this has a place in our economic growth that doesn't fit our traditional bucket. So I think we're really shortchanging ourselves as a nation and doing us a disservice by not really getting in front of this, understanding the power of the technology, because trust me when I tell you, other people, countries, regions are, and it's going to be our loss.
Well, we live in an exciting time, Vince, where we're at the crossroads of technology and capital markets and innovation and regulation. And as always, you have great insights, and we'll look forward to hearing more and following you at Fintech TV. We really appreciate you having us on. Dara, thank you for being on.
Wait, we're going to have you on. We'll have to do the reversal.
That'd be great. Dara, thanks again for another great episode of Capital Ideas. Everyone else, if you want to see more about ICAN, you can go to icanlaw.org. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next episode of Capital Ideas. Thanks very much.